It began with a silence that felt heavier than the weight of 1,000 guns. In early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of its power. 6 carriers, the most experienced aviators on Earth, and a fleet that had conquered the Pacific in months. Yet beneath that brilliance was a quiet problem no one dared to speak aloud. Japan's naval leadership believed they had reached perfection, when in truth, they had already begun to fall behind. The war had given them triumphs that fed a dangerous illusion. The raid on Pearl Harbor, the sinking of the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, and the lightning victories across the Philippines and Malaya, all convinced Tokyo that their tactics were flawless. But every success hid a seed of failure. Japan's carriers were at sea constantly, bleeding veteran pilots faster than they could train new ones. Each loss at sea cost not only aircraft but irreplaceable experience. In Washington and San Diego, thousands of American recruits trained on new Grumman Wildcats and Douglas Dauntlesses. In Japan, pilot schools still used outdated biplanes, insisting that spirit could overcome machinery. That belief, the worship of the warrior soul over technology, was the silent fracture that would one day break the empire's sword. By mid-1942, that fracture widened. The Battle of Midway was the first shock, when 4 of Japan's frontline carriers burned in a single day. The loss was not just ships, it was the annihilation of the Navy's elite. The men who had flown since China, who had studied carrier warfare before anyone else, vanished in fire and smoke. The replacement pilots who came after them would never be the same. What the Americans learned in 6 months, Japan refused to change for 2 years. Admiral Yamamoto, a visionary trapped by tradition, believed Japan could still fight by will alone. He saw the industrial tide rising in the United States, but hoped for a decisive battle to end the war quickly. Instead, Japan's shipyards could not match the flood of Essex-class carriers pouring from American docks. For every hull Japan launched, America launched 10. The Navy Bureau in Tokyo was slow to adapt. Radar? It was seen as unreliable. Encrypted communications? Considered dishonorable. Even simple damage control systems, watertight compartments, automatic pumps, lagged behind their American counterparts. Japanese ships were beautifully engineered, but dangerously fragile. When struck, they burned quickly and died hard. The months after Midway were a quiet disaster. Fuel grew scarce. Training hours were cut. Pilots flew with minimal instruction and were sent into combat after barely 60 hours in the air. Maintenance crews salvaged broken planes to repair others. Morale remained outwardly strong, but doubt had begun to settle in the heart of every sailor who looked across the Pacific and wondered if the Emperor's Navy still ruled the waves. The Americans, meanwhile, learned from every mistake. After the bloody fight at Guadalcanal, they adjusted carrier tactics, refined air coordination, and built a logistical machine capable of sustaining fleets for months at sea. Japan still operated as if each battle would be its last decisive moment. America fought as if the war would never end until total victory was achieved. In Rabaul and Truk, Japanese intelligence officers watched the enemy's expansion with disbelief. They reported carrier task forces that seemed endless, submarines cutting off supply lines, bombers appearing where no airfield was supposed to exist. Yet Tokyo dismissed those reports, believing the Americans lacked the spirit to fight on equal terms. That arrogance turned fatal when the Navy failed to introduce new aircraft designs in time. The legendary Zero fighter, unmatched in 1941, was obsolete by 1943. Its light frame, once an advantage, became a coffin against the heavily armored Hellcats and Corsairs. Engineers proposed replacements, but the bureaucracy stalled. Every prototype drowned in committee debates over honor, funding, or industrial capacity that no longer existed. By the time Yamamoto himself was shot down over Bougainville in 1943, the Navy had lost not just its admiral, but its direction. The empire was still vast, but its communications were fraying, its supply chains strangled, and its training schools running on fumes. The 2 lost years between Midway and the Marianas became the black hole from which Japan's navy would never escape. Factories bombed nightly struggled to keep pace. The pilots who survived Guadalcanal returned to find replacements unable to perform basic maneuvers. Commanders ordered them to teach, but there was no time. Each week brought another operation, another desperate sortie into the Pacific, and another list of names that would never return. The tragedy was not merely one of numbers, it was a philosophy. Japan's navy had built its entire doctrine on the notion of decisive battle, a single perfect encounter that would determine the fate of empires. The Americans built theirs on endurance, and endurance in the industrial age always wins. By late 1943, Tokyo began to realize that even victories now cost too much. Every ship damaged took months to repair. Every aircraft lost required resources Japan could no longer spare. Pilots still shouted their emperor's name as they took off, but many knew they were flying toward inevitable death. The sea of the rising sun was slowly turning against its master. By the beginning of 1944, the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. What had once been their ocean, their empire of islands, bases, and fleets, had become a vast battlefield of loss and retreat. The Imperial Navy that had once thundered across the seas was now forced to defend fragments of coral and volcanic rock, tiny dots on the map that the Americans were determined to capture one by one, no matter the cost. The nightmare began with the Marianas Campaign. For Tokyo, those islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were more than outposts. They were the shield protecting the Japanese homeland. If they fell, American bombers would be within range of Tokyo itself. And so the Navy gathered what remained of its carrier strength for one final test of will, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was here that the myth of Japanese naval air power finally died. On June 19, 1944, hundreds of Japanese aircraft rose from their decks in precise, disciplined waves, the same kind of attack that had crushed Pearl Harbor. But this time, the Americans were waiting. Radar guided the U.S. fighters straight into their path. The Hellcats formed into tight squadrons, diving out of the sun with guns blazing. Within minutes, the sky became a slaughterhouse. In just one day, Japan lost over 400 aircraft and nearly every trained pilot who could still fly a carrier plane. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it something else, the death of the Navy's soul. The battleships and carriers that survived limped home to ports already running out of fuel. Even Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, had to be anchored to conserve what little oil remained. Japan's mighty fleet now existed mostly on paper, proud, enormous, but paralyzed. And still, the Imperial General Staff refused to surrender the illusion of power. They drafted new plans, desperate, almost delusional, to lure the Americans into one last decisive battle. That dream culminated in October 1944, in the waters around the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. Japan threw everything it had left into the fight. Carriers used as bait, surface fleets charging headlong into overwhelming firepower, and pilots barely trained to land, let alone fight. It was a masterpiece of courage, built on the ashes of strategy. At first, the plan seemed to work. Admiral Kurita's center force broke through the Siberian Sea, confronting an outnumbered group of American escort carriers near Samar. The Japanese battleships opened fire, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed that Japan might actually win. But the Americans did what they had done all war. They adapted. Tiny destroyers, hopelessly outgunned, charged straight at battleships 10 times their size. They laid smoke, launched torpedoes, and bought enough time for carrier aircraft to strike again and again. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese fleet was in ruins. Kurita turned away, not because he lacked courage, but because his fleet was dying faster than he could command it. In that single battle, Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and over 10,000 men. It was no longer a navy. It was a memory. After Leyte, there was no longer any question of victory, only survival. But even in ruin, the Imperial Navy refused to surrender its spirit. With fuel almost gone and pilots scarce, a new order came down from Tokyo, one that would forever define the end of Japan's war. It was called the Special Attack Corps, or as the world would come to know them, the kamikaze. Young men, many barely 20 years old, were told that their deaths could achieve what fleets and admirals could not. They believed that crashing their aircraft into American ships was the purest form of sacrifice, a gift to the emperor, and a final act of defiance. Between October 1944 and August 1945, over 3,800 kamikaze pilots would take off from airfields across the Pacific. They sank or damaged hundreds of Allied ships. Each attack terrified the enemy and horrified even Japan's own officers, who knew they were sacrificing their future for symbolism. Behind these suicides was desperation. The complete collapse of the empire's industrial base. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies were cut off. Factories in Nagoya and Yokosuka ran on candlelight. By 1945, Japan's shipyards could no longer produce a single operational carrier. The air fleet that had once ruled the skies now relied on obsolete Zeros and wooden gliders. And then came Okinawa, the last and bloodiest battle of all. The Japanese Navy scraped together everything that could still float. The pride of the fleet, Yamato, was ordered on a one-way mission to beach itself on Okinawa and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. It was a mission born of pure fatalism. On April 7, 1945, American aircraft spotted her, 300 miles north of Okinawa. Hundreds of dive bombers and torpedo planes descended in waves. Within hours, the ocean boiled with fire. Yamato took 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs before capsizing, taking 3,000 sailors with her. The last symbol of Japan's naval power vanished beneath the waves, leaving only silence. From that moment, the war was no longer a contest of fleets or pilots. It was the slow, agonizing collapse of an empire that had believed too much in destiny and too little in adaptability. Factories crumbled under B-29 firebombing raids. Shipyards lay in ruins. Training centers stood empty. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Imperial Navy had fewer than a dozen ships capable of sailing. The admirals who survived surrendered their flags, not to dishonor, but to inevitability. They had fought for a dream that no longer existed, a dream of supremacy through sacrifice. In the end, Japan's defeat was not just military, it was philosophical. They had believed that courage could overcome industry, that spirit could replace strategy. But war had entered a new age, an age of machines, of logistics, of nations that could turn factories into armies and oceans into highways of steel. The Imperial Japanese Navy had begun the war as the most advanced force on Earth. It ended the war as a ghost. Yet even in its destruction, its story remains one of awe, not because of what it achieved, but because of how far it dared to reach before falling. The men who sailed those ships, who launched from those carriers, who faced impossible odds with calm and conviction, they were not fools. They were believers, believers in a cause, in a code, and in a world that was disappearing before their eyes. The legacy of the Imperial Japanese Navy is not one of evil or glory. It is a warning that pride, when left unchecked, can sink even the mightiest of fleets, that courage without wisdom becomes tragedy, and that in war, the greatest enemy is not always the one across the sea, but the one within. The Pacific swallowed an empire, but it also revealed a truth, that power built on arrogance will always be defeated by persistence, learning, and unity. This was the rise and fall of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force that changed the world and paid the ultimate price for believing it could not lose. If you found this story powerful, I invite you to stay with us, because there are more untold stories of courage, tragedy, and redemption waiting to be discovered. Watch our next documentary on screen now, and remember to subscribe for more deep, cinematic explorations into the hidden battles of World War II.